Okay, this is a training on prospecting workflow best practices. The first video that we're going to kick things off with will just introduce the general way that we go about using different tools like Salesforce versus SalesLoft, and kind of what the overarching methodology and philosophy is about how to kind of use those two platforms in tandem with one another, and what the expectation should be regarding how one is most useful to you versus another. And so I'm going to start with an overall statement about the use of Salesforce and the use of SalesLoft and how you should think about the two as you approach this. All of the data that you'll be working with in terms of account data, contact data, activity data, all of the kind of source of truth for all of that, where it's all kind of logged and documented and reported on, etc., that's Salesforce. Salesforce is our database for everything related to prospect and customer prospect data, whether it's building data, account data, contact data, opportunity data, etc. Everything lives in Salesforce. So that's a good starting place. That's your foundation. That is the place where all of your organization about, or all of your kind of account and contact organization takes place. That's where data is both kind of inputted and extracted from. And then you can think of SalesLoft as kind of a layer on top of that, where you take the data that exists in Salesforce and you are simply utilizing it in SalesLoft. So you're kind of exporting it from Salesforce to SalesLoft so that you can do some things with it in regards to holding yourself accountable to your kind of personal workflow. But the truth lies with Salesforce. That's the starting place. That's where all of your organization should happen. And then when you're ready to kind of move things into a specific workflow that you want to hold yourself accountable to, when it makes sense to do so with a tool like SalesLoft, that's where you layer that tool on top, if that makes sense. So as just kind of a beginning here in regards to getting yourself set up for success in Salesforce as it pertains to being ready to start prospecting, the kind of main place that you'll be is in your account list view. And you should have a list that has, for instance, all of your prospect accounts, perhaps a list that has all of your engaged accounts and things like that. But just kind of taking a look at your full prospect account list, and I'll just choose one here as an example. Your list might look something like this, where you have different data points for your accounts up on the screen, and the columns of data that you have can then be sorted. You can sort by that particular data. So let's say that you wanted to look at every account that had a last activity date that was kind of newer versus older. You can do that. And so now it's showing me all of the accounts based on their last activity with the most recent activity up top. And as you scroll through those, the activities that happened further into the past will show up behind those. If you wanted to sort by the building that the account is related to, you can do that as well if you have that column on your list view. Perhaps you want to sort by something else. Maybe it's the vertical or the number of employees, which for us is the employee number default field, this one right here. You can do that. All kinds of ways that you can kind of sort your account data, so you can start to figure out a strategy for yourself about how you want to approach your prospecting. And so some simple ways to think about prospecting are just based on some of those groups of data that I just mentioned. So many of the account executives on our team have kind of always lived by a building by building approach. And they kind of think of prospecting in a way where they want their kind of messaging and communication to be focused on the building address so that they can more easily have consistency in their messaging. So, maybe they want to first look at all of their accounts in 10 West 33rd Street and begin to put a strategy together to reach out to those accounts, because you can use a lot of the same messaging. We completed a project in your building, 10 West 33rd Street, and it just kind of helps maybe to be a little bit more efficient with the way that you think about moving into prospecting. But there are so many different ways to go about doing this. Another way, for instance, I've got these columns up here that have the AE custom field in them. There's also a strategy field here. And so if you click into an account, and let's say that you decide that what you're going to do once you have your account list is you're going to do kind of a bunch of account research, very basic up front, where you're verifying the address, you're doing some research to determine what contacts, if any, you can identify as being potential decision makers to reach out to. Can you identify the owner of the company, or if it's a larger organization, the IT person, perhaps an office manager, maybe a finance person, something like that. However you want to go about doing that, maybe you have some criteria for how you want to even more kind of specifically and strategically organize your accounts. And maybe if we're working first with accounts in 10 West 33rd Street, maybe you want to further kind of segment them by accounts that you deem as being a little bit higher target value, meaning maybe they're a little bit larger, perhaps they have contacts that you have deemed worthy of emailing directly because they could be potential decision makers. And that kind of criteria is how you think about a more targeted type of an account, versus maybe like a more high volume type of an account where you have very little data, you're just going to be calling the main number, you don't have a specific person to email, and your workflow is going to be a little bit more high volume in that regard. There's not, a bunch of research, there aren't individuals specifically that you'll be asking for initially. And that's where those fields come into play. So in prospecting details, if you did decide to utilize that as a way to organize yourself, you can use these targeted and high volume strategy delineators, and that gives you another way to further sort your account list. Another field is the AE custom field, where you can just input text that, again, you can sort by. Let's say that you do have accounts where you have identified a potential decision maker and you just want to label all of those as DM so you can very quickly find them in the list by sorting by the AE custom field, because you're going to take those accounts and work them in a very specific way, in a very particular cadence that has decision maker type email templates in it, etc. And so there are different things you can do to just organize yourself in that regard. And then once you input that stuff into your account, when you're in your account list, you can then sort by that criteria. So if you were using the strategy field and it had some different selections, in this list there is kind of no use of the strategy field, but if you were using it, you could sort by targeted versus high volume versus those that are not delineated. Again, AE custom field, if you used that, you'd be able to sort by those groupings as well. So let's just say, for the sake of keeping this simple, that my approach as a sales rep is going to be sorting by building, because I want to take it as a building by building approach. And now I have to determine kind of what my strategy is going to be in terms of outreach to those accounts. So let's say that I'm going to start with 10 West 33rd Street, and I'm going to pull up kind of each of these accounts. I'm going to do my research on them, obviously add contacts where I need to, perhaps do some of the things I was just talking about with the strategy field or AE custom field, but I'm just going to work on 10 West 33rd right now. Once I've done kind of my due diligence on the account kind of QC and research, I'm then ready to move into the phase of deciding what my prospecting cadence is going to look like. So if we pretended for a moment that we didn't have a tool like SalesLoft and all you had was Salesforce, you would have a more simplistic way of kind of going about this, where you can just say to yourself, okay, today I'm going to start reaching out to all of the accounts at 10 West 33rd, and I'm going to, probably as a best practice, try to reach out to those accounts every other day until I get a yes or a no, or I reach 15 touches plus and I decide that it's not worth continuing to reach out, and I unqualify them for not being able to make contact. So if you didn't have a tool like SalesLoft, you'd kind of pull these up one by one. You would either make your call generically to the company main number and do some discovery work to figure out who you're supposed to speak to, or if you had someone specific that you wanted to talk to on your contact list that you had added or discovered, you might ask for that person directly. Maybe you'll also send an email in the moment, just through Gmail, but again, you don't have the usage of a tool like SalesLoft. And basically it's up to you then to kind of come back to a list like this every couple days, sort by last activity, figure out when you last reached out to the account. If you're trying to touch them every other day, you can reference the date that you last had activity on that account. You can say, oh, I'm due for another activity on this account. So you can do the kind of cadence, or you can execute the kind of cadence that you want without a tool like SalesLoft. It's just very manual. There's no kind of prompt to kind of do this step next. It's looking at the activity history. What did I do last? When did I do my last activity? Who did I do that activity with? And kind of what's my next step? If you use a tool like SalesLoft, it basically allows you to then move the kind of accounts and contacts over into a tool that then sets you up to reach out in a very particular rhythm with a set number of steps, with kind of time in between where you are kind of touching the account and not touching the account, and to do this as specifically as you want to. And so in the next video, we'll kind of get into what it looks like to take these accounts and the contacts related to these accounts and move them into that SalesLoft prospecting kind of a workflow.